Hey everyone and welcome. I have in front of you a plastic bin here full of different types of frozen vegetables and fruits. And what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be feeding my worms. And in addition to the frozen fruits and veggies, we've got some spent coffee grinds, which is also another customary feeding item that I include in most of my worm feedings. What I've got going on back here on the shelf are 4 gray trays, 4 worm bins that are a little bit larger in capacity, as well as 2 slightly smaller bins on the bottom there on the shelf that are really just pots, planters, and those also have worms in them. So we've got 6 bins that have not been fed for about 7-8 days now. The large bins, it's been 7 days, and the 2 small ones, it's been 8 days since they were last fed. So we're going to be bringing those bins up onto the bench here to give each one a feeding and see how they're all coming along. So why don't we get to work on that? Turn on some lights and we'll get to feeding these guys. Now, in addition to having some fresh fruits and veggies on hand for feeding, I also like to keep some dried leaves as well as some pulverized eggshell on hand, because those are also key elements to feeding the worm bins. So I'm going to set these items aside and get the first of the 6 bins out here so we can feed them. Okay, so now the first of our bins here is at the age of 190 days, and that puts it only 3 days away from being the oldest bin that I've ever harvested. And a week ago, you might remember that we were attempting to work the last of the inhabitants out of this finished compost area and get them to move over into this new feeding zone. And I don't remember exactly how high up the levels were, but I usually try to keep things kind of level so that I can use it as a benchmark as to see how things are doing. And this is significantly depressed from the last time we checked in. So that would indicate to me that the food that was added into this last time was more or less depleted, causing the level to drop a lot, and then that probably means there's a bunch of worms hanging out in here, and correspondingly that means there's fewer worms probably in this so-called almost finished compost. So that's exactly what we're driving towards. So why don't we take a peek in here to see how things are progressing. To make that easier, I've got this little yellow bin, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to scoop out all of the leaf cover and place it into the yellow bin so that we can use it at the end to cover up with again, since it's all in pretty good shape still. Most of the leaves are still intact. I'm sure the leaves, to a certain point, the ones that were on the bottom at least, were probably nibbled a little bit. So if need be, I can always add a little bit more, but I don't think that's going to be necessary. Here, it's interesting because this piece of cardboard was placed in here fresh last week. It was a whole piece, and all of this deterioration here is the result of worms coming across from the compost into the feeding zone, and I guess finding that some of the juices from the food had soaked into the cardboard, making the cardboard just as appealing to them as the food itself in the feeding zone. So that's pretty encouraging to see. We had thrown some rice in here, and we can see some remnants of the rice. But other than that, there was a whole bunch of other stuff in here, such as greens, certain types of greens and veggies, of which I could see some traces, a little bit of green here and there, but barely anything to show for it, which is pretty incredible. They just burned right through most of the food that they were given a week ago. And I think that was evident just as soon as I took the paper off. I could see right away what had happened. And you know, for that matter, I did put a fair amount of rice in here too, so it looks like the rice that was added also got gobbled up too. Very nice. Now, if we were to pick around here a little bit, I'm sure we would find a fair number of worms hanging out, again, as we did previously. But this go around, I'm not going to be attempting to extract any worms this time. I'm just going to add more food to try to encourage the ongoing depopulation of the finished compost. So So here and there we hit certain pockets of more densely populated areas where the worms are congregating. It might have been underneath a section where a more juicy piece of food had been added last. So this looks pretty good. I had thought about maybe using some of the leafy matter that I have in the box over there as a bedding for this next feeding, but there's still a fair amount of cardboard in here, which I'm going to just continue to use as the bedding for the new feeding. Fluff it up a little bit to give the worms a medium in which they can pass through easily. Just going to pull back the finished compost a little bit just so I can reach underneath and get a sense of how many are just hanging out right there on the perimeter. That always seems to be the spot where you find the most of them. A lot of them were brave to make their way over into the new feeding zone. A lot of them just sort of hang out there on the edge in the more familiar compost material. And that's perfectly fine. At some point they'll all make their way over. So I think this is more or less what we were after. I like what I'm seeing here. Now, as I mentioned last time, I like to keep my my feeding zone and my finished compost in these cases a little bit sort of kind of separated if possible, with a little bit of a partition wall or something of that sort. So I put this piece back here, but it doesn't seem to amount to much. You know what I'm going to do here? Here we go. This is the piece that I had actually set aside to use in the other bin. The other bin still had enough of the old retaining wall remaining that we didn't need to deploy it. So what we can do is we'll just place this cardboard right into the feeding zone as additional bedding. And we'll just go ahead and we'll use this fresh piece of cardboard here to take on the role of partition wall going forward. So now, with only 3 days remaining before this becomes my oldest bin, I'm definitely curious to see if by chance is this material possibly ready already. Last time I felt like I went through the trouble of setting up the partition wall and deploying a fresh feeding, and only afterwards did we actually check the material to see how the depopulation of the worms had progressed. And here, as I start to upturn some of the material from the bottom to see if I can find worms, I'm not really encountering any. As you can see, I guess if we do upturn some of the material from the very edge of the feeding zone, it's more or less expected that we're going to find some more worms hanging out there. But I'm almost thinking that, with the exception of the worms that are hanging out right at the perimeter of the finished compost and the new feeding zone, we more or less have finished compost here, which is more or less depopulated at this point. I mean, I'm picking down, searching the bottom, here and there encountering a worm, which I might have actually moved over there in the process of jostling the stuff around a bit. Yeah, I mean, if you look down in here, what you have is basically finished compost free of any worms. Free of any worms whatsoever. So you know what I'm going to do here? I'm going to give the worms that are still kind of hanging out at the perimeter, and any worms that might still be in here that I missed, a little bit more time, just a little bit more time. I think that's going to push this bin to being the oldest bin that I've ever had before harvesting it. Although technically it feels like this could really be harvested immediately. But whatever, doesn't matter. So we'll probably get this bin up near 200 days in age before we finally get around to migrating the worms out, the last batch of worms out, and harvesting the last of the compost. But I do want to give this material a little bit more time to dry out. It's got a nice texture, but it still feels a little bit more damp than I'm accustomed to having. And we do see a few more worms hanging out right there on the perimeter, so we're going to give those little guys a little bit more of a chance to work their way out into the new feeding zone and get out of the finished compost. Now, the only way I'm going to do this a little bit differently, though, is to see if I can create more of a lure on this side of the bin as opposed to right along the perimeter. So right along the perimeter here, I'm going to lay down a little bit of fresh leafy matter. And that too is stuff that the worms consider to be perfectly edible and appetizing. But I figured if they make their way into that and then start to realize that, hey, right nearby there's a whole bunch more, much more delicious food to be had, then maybe they'll make their way more in and away from the edge there. So let's give them a little bit of peeled cucumber. Try to move it away from the edge. A little bit of celery. Some chopped up carrot. Some more celery, some asparagus cuttings. And then a little bit of coffee grinds. And you'll notice that here on the edge it's mostly leafy matter and most of the food is away from the barrier. And we'll just throw in a little bit of grit too, since that always helps. And we'll let this go just a little bit longer and see what we wind up with. Let's return this material that we skimmed off the top to continue its role as the cover. And here too, there's more or less kind of a level here, kind of a level top between the two sides. So if it drops again a lot, especially out on the outer edge where the food's being added, it'll be quite clear and visible. So I like what we're seeing here. This is really progressing just the way I had hoped. So very promising. Let's get this one back up on the shelf and move to the other one that's set up in a similar way. Alright, so now this bin is not quite as old. It's not really approaching the age of being the oldest like the other one we just checked in on was. This one's now at day 160. The last one we just did was at day 189. 193 being the oldest that I've ever had a bin go before harvesting it. But these were both set up in a very similar fashion to one another. So we should find pretty comparable results. Let's do what we did before, is push back the finished compost layer a little bit if we could. And well, here's that piece of cardboard I talked about earlier. The one that was still good enough to be used as a barrier wall last week, but I would say at this point its only purpose going forward is to use it as bedding. And let's do what we did earlier. We'll just go ahead and we'll grab this yellow container and skim off the leafy matter off the top that's still in pretty good shape so that we can return it to be the covering once we add more food here. Not a whole lot coming off. A lot of it seems to have settled down into the bin and is being consumed as food. This is just some cardboard which will be restored to the bottom of the feeding zone as bedding. And this bin still shows some signs of the last feeding, a couple grains of rice here and there, a couple signs of the green asparagus or whatever it was that they were given last time, but not much else really. You can see that they're congregating down underneath the cardboard the way they always seem to like to do. So we'll just take a quick peek at how many of them have made their way over here in the past week. It's a fair number of them. I like what I'm seeing. It's very good. So here too, along the feeding zone edge, we're finding lots more worms. Worms that kind of like hanging out right there on the cusp of the finished compost material and the new feeding zone. We've got a fair amount of reusable bedding material here in the form of cardboard. So we'll just go ahead and we'll do what we did before, is we're going to fluff this up again a little bit, leaving the worms for now, and maybe relocating them at some point in the near future. And you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the camera off here quickly, and I'm going to fashion another piece of cardboard we can use as a barrier wall in here, because I think that always seems to work nicely in terms of keeping these separate and distinct from one another. So why don't we take a short break so I can go ahead and carve off a piece of cardboard that would fit nicely in here as a barrier, and we'll get back to this in just a moment. Okay, so that didn't take very long at all. I just took a piece of cardboard and cut it to size and punched it full of holes so that it can continue to serve the purpose of a retaining wall here between the finished compost and the feeding zone. And we're going to do the same as we did earlier, is we're just going to lay in a little bit of kind of generic bedding material, sort of maybe not as interesting as fresh veggies and fruits might be, along here, along the very perimeter, so that we can then add a variety of more savory pieces like celery, a little bit more zucchini peelings, I believe, or maybe cucumber peelings, some more stuff that looks like asparagus pieces, and then on top we're just going to add a little bit of coffee grinds too. So what we have here is another very similar setup to what we have on the oldest bin. This bin being managed in a very similar way as the oldest bin. And I'm just going to use these reclaimed leaves to cover up with. If and when the food in the feeding zone gets depleted, it should really cause a significant depression on this side. But before we proceed, why don't we just take a quick glance at how things are progressing in this bin's finished compost section. I think we're seeing a similar thing here. We start to dig down, and we start to encounter a lot of finished compost, but not many worms whatsoever. Last week we still saw a fair number of worms still hanging out in this material, but this week it seems like we're seeing quite a bit less, and maybe none at all. I mean, I'm picking through here and I'm not seeing any worms hanging out, which is terrific. That's exactly what we're after. Just so we can really get a sense of how this material is progressing in terms of depopulation, I'm trying to search it over on this far end only, just to see what we encounter. And here too, I'm picking through and bringing the material all the way from the bottom up to the surface to examine it. And as I do, and as I look through it, I find no worms. That is perfect. That is exactly what we're after with a horizontal migration. The whole idea being that the worms do all the work. And at the end, all you need to do is scoop out the finished compost and use it in your gardening. So as we work our way to the perimeter of where the feeding zone is, we're going to obviously encounter more worms that have yet to traverse the barrier and make their way to where the feeding zone is occurring. But I'm optimistic that this is going to continue to progress as it has been over the past few weeks, and ultimately end up with a fairly nicely depopulated pile of compost over here. Very, very cool. So here again, I guess the idea is not to move worms away from the feeding zone, so let's just keep them near the barrier wall. I just wanted to kind of fluff up some of the material and aerate it a bit, and you know, at the same time examine how it's progressing, but this is very, very nice. Exactly what we were hoping to see. All right. Well, I'm giving this one another high mark, just like I did the last bin we checked in on. So I'm very happy to see what we're observing here. Why don't we cover up and proceed? Alright, well, I know we originally talked about feeding all these bins, but now these two bins over here are the bins that you might remember are loaded with all kinds of very slow composting food items. There's mango shells or mango pits, which have very hard shells. There's a bunch of corn cobs, which are fairly slow composting food items. These bins, I took a quick peek in the feeding zones because I didn't see a fair depression happening in terms of the level dropping down. And after I poked around in there a little bit, I did observe that there's a fair amount of food left from the previous feeding. And then on top of that, there's a lot of that old slow composting material in these bins as well. So I've decided to just skip these and proceed straight over to feeding these two nightcrawler pots. So let's get these up on the bench, and we'll get these guys fed, and then we'll be finished. Let's do one at a time. We have these are the African nightcrawlers. We'll start with them. The African nightcrawler bin has a slightly smaller population. It was started with 100 cocoons originally. And those 100 cocoons were placed into the time lapse that I had set up, which showed the progress of 3 different types of worms growing from their infant stages as cocoons to newly born worms to the point where they matured and start gobbling away and doing what they do. So I am noticing a lot of flying insects in this bin, and it might be because of what I fed them most recently. I don't remember what it was, but maybe it was some sort of a food item that they that these flying insects really enjoy. Maybe it was some sort of a fruit or something. I don't remember exactly. So I'm gonna just fluff things up a little bit here to see how things are progressing. Take a quick peek here and there. As I poke down near the bottom, I can see worms hanging out in each handful. There had been a fair amount of liquid in these bins, so that's the reason I had put these little catch trays beneath them to allow the liquid to drain out. Bugs are all over me. Jeez. So let's see. What I did here was I excavated a little bit of a crevice down here at the bottom. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take this leafy matter that was resting on the very tippy top and drop it back down in there to be bedding for them. Get it down to the bottom. There's other stuff hanging out here on the sides, cardboard and whatever. We'll just leave that off on the sides. And then we'll go ahead and we'll put some food in here, but it doesn't seem like that much food is going to be needed because there aren't all that many worms, even though it does look like they depleted what they were given last time. So even though there's a bunch of flying insects cruising around here, I'm going to sort of tempt fate and continue to feed things that might draw more of the same. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover up as best I can with a lot more leafy matter, hopefully suppressing the smell and preventing the flying insects from congregating here as much. So we've added an old peach, and I actually pulled the pits out. I've got a couple different types of fruits like this in my feeding bin. So plum, this peach, a couple different things with pits in them. I took the pits out just because the pits probably take forever to get broken down. So besides this nectarine or peach or whatever it is, we got some cucumber cuttings here. And I guess we'll take another lump of this celery here and just kind of plop it down here in the middle for them. We're going to add some more grit, which is just pulverized eggshell, as well as some coffee to cover all of that up with. I think that's probably going to help too in terms of suppressing some of that fruity sweet smell that the flying insects are drawn to. On top, we're going to go ahead with a nice generous topping of dry leafy matter. The dry leafy matter I think is fine because the material down in the bin is fairly damp, plenty moist as far as I'm concerned. So I kind of like what I'm seeing here, and I think we're off to a pretty good start. This bin here is 100 days old now, if you want to consider it from the point in time when the time lapse was originally started to when those cocoons were placed into the time lapse bin and left to hatch and grow. So I'm actually treating all of my nightcrawlers as having the same age. So we're now at day 100 with these. So we've got the African nightcrawlers fed. Let's move on to the European nightcrawlers. Now, the European nightcrawlers were started with a larger quantity. I was given 500 cocoons to start with. And for that reason, I'm sure we're going to see a lot more progress on the food that they were given. And that's why I think we're seeing so few leaves here on top, because they've actually depleted what food they were given previously, and they've actually proceeded to eating the leafy matter that was on top, which is perfectly fine. That's really the reason it's there. So we're just going to go ahead and leave that in there since there's not much sense in pulling it out. But we're going to, I guess we're going to just poke around a little bit in here to see how the European nightcrawlers are coming along. As we pull back a handful of material, we can see worms throughout. Same thing here. I have noticed that this being a larger bin, probably given a larger quantity of food last time, was producing a lot more drippings in the little catch tray that I've got resting underneath the shelf that these pots sit on. Here on the wall I could see some pretty small size worms cruising around. So I wonder if that indicates that they're already old enough to be breeding and spawning off their own next generation. Because every one of these nightcrawlers I have were all spawned off from cocoons. And it's only been 100 days since I've been raising nightcrawlers, so it's kind of a new thing for me. Yeah, I don't see any signs of any of the food that they were given. It's all bedding material, mostly cardboard, the kind of bedding material that takes a little bit longer for them to chew down and deplete. So this is pretty cool. I like what I'm seeing. I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to excavate a hole down to the bottom. Here we have a piece of corn, which was part of the original feeding when I set this up in the previous container that these were in, but it's almost unrecognizable and has fallen apart into little bits at this point. So they've done a really nice job in 100 days working down that corn cob. So yeah, let's create a nice deep hole here for them, into which we can once again lay down some leafy matter as a bedding. And then instead of a peach, I have a plum here. Again, I've removed the pit. Come on, buddy. Get back in there. I'm not used to these nightcrawlers. Nightcrawlers tend to crawl a lot more. Here's the other half of that plum. Like all the other bins got today. A nice generous portion of celery. Good stuff. And even a few pieces of cucumber and asparagus. So they've got a nice variety of different food items in here to feast on. And then we've got some coffee to give them as well. Oh, that's it for the coffee. But that's pretty good because that's going to cover all of that fruity, savory stuff so that hopefully the flying insects are less drawn to the bin. So we've created a nice volume in here for the worms to cruise around in. Let's use another generous portion of leaves to cover this pot up too. That pretty much brings us to the finish of what we were trying to accomplish today. So all that's left to do here is to cover these little guys up and get them back on the shelf. And then I'll clean up the little mess I created here, but we won't keep you around for that. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, then I always appreciate you leaving me a thumbs up. And also consider becoming a subscriber to the channel. That's appreciated as well. So hopefully we'll see you back again here next time. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Bye now.